The cabin smelled of pine and smoke, the kind of scent that lingered in wood the way memories linger in a person, and she stood near the doorway with her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale, watching the mountain man stack the last piece of firewood as if order itself might calm the uncertainty fluttering in her chest. The ceremony had been small, almost quiet enough to feel imagined. A preacher who traveled through twice a year, 2 neighbors who offered bread and blessings, and the wide sky as their witness. And yet now that the day had thinned into evening, the reality pressed against her like a weight she did not know how to carry. She had been told more than once that she was too quiet, too unremarkable, too unsure. And though no one had meant cruelty, the words had collected over the years until they formed a shadow she could not step out of easily, especially tonight when the word bride rested on her shoulders like a garment she feared she would not. Phil. The mountain man noticed her silence without turning, the way he seemed to notice everything. Storms by the way the wind shifted, winter by the way the birds disappeared, and now her thoughts by the way she did not cross the floor. And he set the last log gently, as if refusing to startle whatever fear she was trying to hold still. Outside, the creek kept up its steady murmur, and the sound only made the cabin feel smaller, more intimate, reminding her that there was no longer distance to hide behind, no longer the old house with thin walls where she slept separate and unnamed, where expectations were whispered rather than spoken. She swallowed, then tried to speak twice before the words finally found courage enough to leave, her voice thinner than she wanted. Am I enough? The question hung there, not dramatic, not pleading, but honest. The kind of honesty that comes when a person has run out of ways to pretend. She could not meet his eyes at first, afraid she would see either pity or surprise, and both would hurt, because pity would feel like confirmation, and surprise would mean he had never considered the question. He took a slow breath, turned, and crossed the room without haste, stopping close enough that she could see the rough line of the scar along his knuckle, the weather in the creases around his eyes, the patience that had shaped a man who learned to live where winters did not forgive mistakes. He did not answer right away, and the silence, instead of feeling heavy, felt careful, as if he understood that careless reassurance could bruise where it meant to heal. Then he spoke, gently, steady as the creek, telling her that he had chosen her with both eyes open, that strength did not live in loud people alone, and that he had never needed someone to impress the world, only someone he could trust to share it. When he said, "For me, yes," it did not sound like a promise shaped to soothe, but like a truth placed into her. Hands, in the question that had followed her for years, loosened the slightest bit, as if it had finally met a place where it did not need to defend itself anymore. Morning brought a softer kind of light, the pale, forgiving kind that slips through cracks in old shutters and turns dust motes into something almost gentle, and she woke to the sound of the mountain man moving quietly so as not to disturb her, the boards creaking beneath his weight like an old friend acknowledging a familiar presence. She lay still for a moment, listening, surprised at how different the cabin felt with her inside it, not because anything physical had changed, but because someone finally expected her to stay, to be included in the rhythm instead of slipping around its edges. When she rose, she found coffee already warming on the stove, and he was outside splitting kindling, his motions unhurried, each swing deliberate as though the day had agreed not to rush them. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch, the cold morning air touching her face with a clarity that grounded rather than startled, and he looked up, nodding a greeting that carried more welcome than many paragraphs could have. He asked how she had slept, not as small talk, but with real interest, and she answered honestly that her sleep had been light at first, then deep, and the way he smiled, short, relieved, not possessive, told her the answer mattered. As they shared breakfast at the small table, she noticed the small ways he had made room for her. A second cup set out as if it had always belonged, space cleared on the shelf without comment, and a chair slid to a better angle near the fire. These details stitched together a sense of belonging more effectively than any speech, and when she reached to help with the dishes, he didn't wave her away or assume she would know what to do. He simply showed her where things went and asked whether a different arrangement would suit her better. It startled her how gently he made space for her opinions, as if the house itself were learning her name with each decision. Later, when he went to check the Snares, he asked if she wanted to walk along, offering the invitation without pressure, and they moved through the trees in companionable quiet, the sound of their boots settling into the earth like punctuation. She thought of the question she had asked the night before and realized it had not vanished, but its sharpest edges had dulled, replaced by something steadier. Curiosity about who she might become in a place where her worth wasn't constantly weighed. At the creek, he showed her where the water ran safest after rains and where the rocks were slickest, not to warn her away, but to share knowledge that suggested a long future lived side by side. When they returned, the cabin seemed to greet them differently, not as strangers arriving, but as people coming home. And for the first time, she felt that maybe being enough had less to do with proving herself and more to do with learning to live inside a life that wanted her there. As the days settled into a rhythm, she began to notice the subtle relief in her own body, the way her shoulders no longer stayed permanently lifted as though bracing for correction. And she realized how many years she had spent trying to anticipate disappointment before it could arrive. The mountain man never once handed her a list of expectations, never suggested that being a wife meant shrinking into invisibility or stretching into perfection. Instead, he treated each day as something they would negotiate together, and that quiet partnership unsettled her at first simply because it was new. When she burned the bread on their third morning, the crust blackened beyond saving. She waited for irritation, for the sigh that would confirm what she had long suspected about herself. But he only scraped the worst of it off, joked that it would make fine breadcrumbs if a bird ever asked for supper, and made another pot without ceremony. That small act, the refusal to turn a mistake into a verdict, worked on her more deeply than any reassurance he had spoken. She found herself learning not only where the extra blankets were kept or which latch stuck after rain, but also that disagreement did not automatically mean disaster. One evening, when she suggested storing tools differently and he hesitated, they talked it through, each listening until a simple solution appeared, and afterward she realized she had not once feared being scolded. Sometimes, while he worked on the fence or repaired the roof, she would sit nearby sewing or shelling beans, aware that silence between them felt full instead of empty. And in those quiet hours, she began to understand that love could be shaped by steady presence as much as by grand gestures. Of course, there were moments when doubt returned, when she caught her reflection in the small, warped mirror and heard echoes of every comment that had ever classified her as not enough, and on those days she spoke less, doing her chores, carefully, waiting to see whether this life would shrink around her the way her old one had. But he seemed to sense those shifts too, asking her gently to walk with him at dusk, letting the cool air and birdsong do half the speaking, and always, at some point, reminding her in small ways that their marriage was not a test she could fail, only a journey they were choosing daily. One night by lamplight, he told her about his own uncertainties, the losses that had taught him caution, the loneliness that once made the cabin echo, and hearing vulnerability in his voice rearranged something inside her, because it meant she was not the only person learning how to belong. By the time the moon rose high and silvered the roof, she understood that becoming enough here did not mean transforming into someone impressive. It meant allowing herself to be seen without flinching, and discovering that being seen was not the danger she had always believed. The first real test came on an evening when the sky turned that bruised color storms wear before they decide whether to break, and a rider passed by the cabin road without slowing, glancing toward the house in a way that made her stomach tighten with an old, familiar dread, the feeling that a stranger's opinion could suddenly rewrite who she was. The mountain man watched the rider disappear, then returned to mending the gate, but she caught the slight change in his posture, the way he filed the moment away without letting it take over the day. When night fell, the wind picked up, tapping the shutters like restless fingers, and she found herself listening for hoofbeats instead of thunder, half expecting a knock at the door with news or judgment or some reminder that happiness was never meant to last. He noticed the way her hands stayed busy long after the dishes were clean, and finally asked what she was waiting for. The question was gentle, but it opened the door she had been keeping shut. She admitted, haltingly, that she had always believed good things were temporary, that someone would eventually appear to claim they had been a mistake, and that she feared being told she did not belong here after all. He sat beside her at the table, the lamplight softening the lines around his eyes, and instead of offering quick comfort, he asked her to tell him where that fear began, as if her history mattered to the future they were building. She spoke of rooms where love was measured by comparison, of praise given to others as an example of what she failed to be, of promises made and withdrawn whenever she did not perform well enough. When she finished, she felt exposed, as though the storm had blown the roof off the cabin. He listened without interruption, then stood, walked to the door, and slid the bolt into place, not dramatically, simply and deliberately. Before returning to take her hands in his, he told her that no stranger on a road could claim what did not belong to him, that this marriage was not a loan that could be recalled, and that fear would be welcomed here only as something to be understood, not obeyed. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain hammering the roof in a steady drumming, and she felt something inside her loosen with it, as if nature itself had released pressure she'd been carrying alone. Later, when they blew out the lamp and the darkness wrapped the cabin like a cloak, she realized the fear had not vanished, but it had been met, named, and answered, and that was a different kind of safety than she had ever known. The days after the storm carried a softer stillness, as if the land itself had listened to their conversation and decided to give them space. And yet she noticed that trust did not grow all at once. Instead, it returned in small, uncertain steps, like deer testing a clearing before stepping fully into it. She began to help him with tasks outside, not because he asked, but because she wanted to understand the shape of his world. And he welcomed her presence without turning it into a lesson or a performance, simply explaining as they worked, letting knowledge pass between them like a tool meant to be shared. One morning, while repairing a stretch of fence, she misjudged the tension, and the wire snapped, biting into her palm hard enough to draw blood. For a moment, the old instinct surged, the instinct to apologize rapidly, to brace for frustration, and she swallowed the words already forming. But he reached for her hand not with irritation, only concern, guiding her to the shade and washing the cut gently, his brows drawn not in anger, but in worry that she might think the mistake defined her. He wrapped the wound carefully, then said something that stayed with her long after the sting faded, that a life built together would always carry small failures, and that love's strength was proven in what happened after them, not in pretending they never occurred. That afternoon, as she sat on the porch sewing, she thought about his words and realized that being enough might actually mean being allowed to be imperfect without fear of losing everything. Still, the habit of doubt was stubborn. When he planned a trip into town for supplies, she offered to stay behind, half convinced she would be safer alone than exposed to strangers' eyes that might weigh and compare. He paused, studying her, and then invited her to choose, genuinely choose, reminding her that her comfort mattered as much as his errands. After a long moment, she chose to go. The road wound past fields and over a narrow ridge where birds rode the currents of air, and while she sat beside him on the wagon seat, she realized that fear felt different when someone sat quietly next to it, instead of demanding it disappear. In town, a few glances slid their way, curious, not cruel, and when a shopkeeper addressed her directly, asking her preference in cloth, she answered, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. On the way home, she noticed she was breathing easier, as if the world had not ended simply because she had taken up space within it. That evening, as twilight gathered like a shawl around the cabin, she understood that trust did not arrive with a single answer to a trembling question. It was being built piece by patient piece, each day proving quietly that she did not have to keep earning a place she had already been given. Autumn began to lean over the valley, brushing the hills with color that seemed to linger between seasons, and she noticed how the cabin took on a warmer life as the days shortened. Quilts aired out, jars lined neatly on shelves, firewood stacked like quiet promises against the cold. With each preparation, she felt more woven into the rhythm, no longer a guest who helped out of politeness, but a partner whose choices mattered. The mountain man never made speeches about their life. Instead, he showed his care by noticing things, moving a chair where the morning light would reach her sewing, setting aside the first ripe apple because he'd seen her glance at it earlier, mending the loose hinge on the chest before it became a bother. These gestures surprised her precisely because they expected nothing in return, and slowly she began to answer in kind, a pot of stew ready when he came back from the ridge, a patch sewn stronger than it needed to be, a hand resting briefly on his shoulder when he sat down after a long day. One evening, while she was brushing her hair by lamplight, she caught him watching not with hunger or ownership, but quiet admiration, as if he were grateful simply to be allowed near this private part of her routine. Embarrassed, she turned away, then forced herself to turn back, choosing trust over reflex, and in that small decision, she felt something settle, like a knot finally releasing. Later, when he spoke about a neighboring homestead that had failed because the couple never learned to listen to one another, she heard not judgment, but worry, the kind born from someone who wanted their marriage to endure the winters ahead. She answered honestly that listening was still new to her, that in the past, silence had been safer than honesty. He nodded, said they could practice together, and the simplicity of the promise carried more comfort than any grand vow. A few days afterward, she confessed another fear, that if she ever faltered, under the weight of this new life, he might someday regret choosing her. He didn't rush his reply. Instead, he took her out to the clearing where he'd felled trees years earlier and showed her the stumps, explaining how roots kept holding the soil long after the trunks were gone. Some things, he said quietly, are strong because they stay. She realized then that his love was not a fire meant to blaze and fade. It was a steady warmth meant to last. That night, as the first hint of frost silvered the grass, she curled beneath the quilt and understood that the question she had asked on their wedding night was no longer a ghost hovering between them. It had become a conversation they were answering together, day by patient day, in ways that words alone could never hold. The first snow arrived earlier than anyone expected, drifting down in patient flakes that softened the edges of everything, and she stood at the window for a long moment, watching the world turn quiet, surprised by how peaceful it felt instead of threatening. Winter had always meant scarcity in her old life, short tempers, measured crumbs, the constant reminder that she should not take up more than her share. But here, the snow seemed like a permission to slow down together. The mountain man brought in another armful of wood and stamped the cold from his boots, smiling at the way her eyes followed the falling white, and he teased gently that the valley always looked honest under snow because nothing could hide its shape. She thought about that while stirring the stew, realizing that she, too, could not hide the shape of herself forever. Sooner or later, she would have to decide what story to believe. Later that afternoon, while he was out checking traps, she found the small wooden box he had left on the table and opened it, expecting tools or nails. Instead, inside lay a simple comb he had carved, smooth as river stone, with a pattern along the edge that echoed the curve of the hills behind the cabin. Tucked beneath it was a folded scrap of paper, his handwriting careful and awkward, saying only that he had made it because her hair looked like something the winter would want to keep warm. It wasn't flowery, it wasn't dramatic, but she sat there with the note in her hands and felt tears rise, not from sadness, but from a tenderness she had never thought could belong to her. When he returned, cheeks red from the cold, she thanked him, unsure how to fit all she felt into those two small words. He shrugged in that quiet, shy way of his, and said he wanted her to have something that had been shaped slowly, the way love should be. That night, after supper, she stood before the mirror and used the comb for the first time, watching as the lamplight traced her. Reflection. For years she had seen only what she lacked: beauty, brilliance, confidence. But now, in the gentle curve of her shoulders and the steadiness in her eyes, she noticed something new. A woman who belonged. She did not suddenly become radiant or transformed. Rather, she recognized herself as worthy of the life she was already living. When she rejoined him by the fire, he did not comment on the comb or her hair. He simply reached for her hand as if that were the most natural gesture in the world. And in that quiet moment, with snow whispering against the windows and warmth gathered close, she understood that the question, "Am I enough?" no longer lived like a wound inside her. It had become an answer she carried, soft, honest, and finally her own. The thaw came late that year, turning the path down to the creek into a ribbon of mud, and one afternoon as she worked outside with the wash, a wagon creaked up the road from the valley, its wheels complaining with each turn. The sound lifted old instincts in her chest, instincts that whispered of messages, corrections, the sudden arrival of voices that could undo everything she had begun to believe. The mountain man stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and they watched together as the wagon slowed, then stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. A woman she recognized from her past climbed down, an aunt by marriage who had once been fond of gentle judgments, and offered a smile that carried more apology than pride. She had come, she said carefully, to see whether the rumors were true, that the quiet girl had married and disappeared into the high country. The words were not meant to wound, yet they stirred a familiar echo, and for a beat, the old fear fluttered, asking if her life here might still be treated as a curiosity, a mistake waiting to be corrected. But the mountain man greeted the visitor politely, invited her to sit, and made it clear with his calm presence that this home did not need approval to be real. Over a cup of coffee, the aunt confessed that some back in town had expected the marriage to fail, had predicted loneliness or hardship would prove too much. Instead, she said, she saw warmth, order, and a steadiness in the bride's face that she had never noticed before. The words surprised her more than they pleased her, because praise from that part of her past had always come with comparison attached. Yet this time, the woman spoke simply, admitting she had misjudged and that perhaps some people were meant to bloom away from voices that doubted them. When the aunt finally turned the wagon around and rattled back down the road, the echo of the visit faded much faster than she expected. She realized, standing there with her hands still damp from the wash, that the past had lost its claim. It could observe, comment, even apologize, but it could not relocate her worth. The mountain man squeezed her shoulder gently and asked if she was all right. She nodded, surprised by the steadiness of the answer. For the rest of the afternoon, the wind carried a faint smell of thawing earth, and she worked in a quiet contentment, aware that some fears don't vanish in a dramatic moment. They simply stop being the loudest voice in the room. And in that realization, she understood that any judgment arriving from the world beyond their valley would now find only a door, not a command, because she had chosen this life, and more importantly, she had learned to stand inside it without waiting for permission. Spring deepened slowly, as if the valley wanted to be certain before committing, and one bright afternoon they rode out together to mend the fence along the high meadow, where the grass grew soft and the wind spoke in long, unbroken sentences. The work was simple but steady, and she took quiet pride in how her hands now moved with confidence, tying, measuring, checking, no longer second-guessing every choice. When a post wobbled, she caught it before it tipped, laughing a little at herself, and the mountain man looked over with the easy affection of someone who saw competence and was still grateful for it. They paused at midday to share bread and dried fruit beneath a cottonwood, the leaves shimmering overhead like coins caught in sunlight, and without planning to, she asked him what he imagined their life would look like in years to come. He considered the horizon for a long moment, then said he hoped for ordinary things, seasons that kept returning, work that mattered, a table that never felt lonely, and the kind of love that grew steady enough to welcome whatever came. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping poetry, only a calm certainty, and it settled into her like warm water after a cold walk. Later, as clouds drifted over the ridge, they rode home at an easy pace, talking about which seeds to plant, which patch of earth caught the best light. Something about the conversation, its lack of urgency, its trust in tomorrow, felt like the truest promise they had ever made. That evening, as they tended chores in unspoken rhythm, a sudden gust blew the door wide, scattering papers across the floor. Instinctively they both reached, but it was she who caught the small carved comb before it slid under the hearth. She held it for a moment, realizing how much of their journey was contained in that simple piece of wood: patience, time, intention. When she handed it back, he only smiled and tucked it into its place, as if to say that what mattered most had already found where it belonged. After supper, they walked the boundary of their land as the sky changed colors, and in the hush between them, she recognized a quiet truth. The question that once trembled in every corner of her heart had been answered not once, but hundreds of times, in laughter shared, in doors bolted gently against fear, in bread scraped free of its burnt edges, in choices made side by side. By the time they returned to the cabin, dusk pooling at their feet, she knew that whatever tomorrow held, she would meet it not as someone hoping to measure up, but as a woman secure inside a love that asked for honesty, not perfection. Summer returned with a warmth that rose from the ground itself, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed pine, and the cabin doors stayed open most days, welcoming breeze and birdsong as if both were old friends. She moved through the rooms with a natural ease now, setting bread to rise while humming, pausing to look out the window when the mountain man crossed the yard, feeling not the nervous flutter of uncertainty, but the deep steadiness of belonging. One evening, after they had finished supper and stepped outside to watch the last of the light fade over the ridge, he sat on the porch rail and asked, almost casually, whether she remembered the question she had asked on their wedding night. She did, of course. It lived in her memory like a faded photograph, important but no longer painful. She nodded, curious, and he said he had never wanted to erase that question from her, only to live beside it until it no longer needed to be afraid. The simplicity of that truth made her chest tighten with gratitude. They sat together in silence for a while, listening to the creek whisper in the distance, and she realized how differently quiet felt now. Not like a test she might fail, but like a space safe enough to breathe in. When the first stars appeared, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time she did not wonder whether she was worthy of the moment. She simply received it. Later, as they prepared for bed, she caught her reflection once more in the mirror and saw not transformation, but integration. The doubts still existed in faint outlines, yet they no longer dictated her choices. She was at last a woman who believed the truth spoken to her, not because he had said it once, but because they had lived it together. Before blowing out the lamp, she whispered a quiet thank you, not to him alone, but to the life that had been patient with her healing. He heard it anyway and squeezed her hand, answering in that steady, gentle way that had become his signature presence in her world. As darkness settled, she thought of all the miles between the frightened bride who once whispered, "Am I enough?" and the woman who now rested without bracing. The journey had not been about becoming perfect. It had been about allowing love to teach her what had been true all along. And as the night wrapped its calm around the cabin, she understood, without needing to ask again, that enough was not a prize she had earned. It was the home she now carried inside her, wherever she would go. Some questions follow us for years because no one ever answers them with patience. She did not find her worth in applause or in becoming someone new. She found it in a man who chose her gently, and in learning to choose herself, too. And sometimes, the quietest love stories are the ones that finally let a heart rest.